view little Georgia is always trying to solve little problems, right? And there was a moment a couple weeks ago where she was asking for food, but I was like, I don't think she's actually hungry. I think it's just a little problem-solving mind, and that was just like a little aspect of boredom. And so instead of giving her food, I suggested we start tidying the toys instead. And she was super happy to do that, and we just started tidying the toys. And then she like learned the new skill of putting her toys away, right?
So you didn't let her eat, and instead you made her clean. Hey, this is...
Your side, how's life? How's everything?
Good, man. Just trying to, just approaching the end of the semester and wrapping shit up. It's been a bit of an annoying semester.
Yeah.
So in other news, you and Brett Hall agreed to an exchange about Austrian economics, and you wrote your first long piece in true Vaden Masrani style. I believe it was like an over hour read. You're not asking too little of your readers, I would say.
No, I saw that the blog now says how long the read is, and I'm like, fuck, that does not look good for me.
63 minutes.
Yeah, it was like 11,000 words of steaminess. But yeah, this is my first little Twitter spat. I've never had like a little Twitter thing before. But yeah, so how did it come about? So I posted a tweet like a couple weeks ago. So, okay, we're recording this on December 8th. And this whole thing was about a week ago. But by the time this episode comes out, it'll probably be a month from now. So just for the listeners to kind of orient themselves temporally. But yeah, so I posted a tweet, like a week and a half ago, 3 weeks ago, just talking about the new president of Argentina, Mr. Milei, and basically saying like, let's just see what happens over the next 4 years, because this is a great opportunity to learn about the effects of certain policy choices. And in particular, I was like, are there any Austrians who want to make some falsifiable predictions about what they can expect to see? Because that's how science works, and that's how experiments work, is you make a prediction and you check it. And of course, the critical rationalist / Austrian economist Twitter sphere were very unhappy with that. And there's all sorts of reasons why they don't want to make predictions, and you can't make predictions according to Austrian economics, and all of these reasons are total bullshit. And that's what the podcast, the blog post is basically going
to not
through.
Give away the theme of the blog.
but then Brett commented, and he's like, according to Popper's famous epistemological impossibility result, you cannot make predictions about human behavior. And that's just flat out not true. That's not at all what Popper says at all. And so we invited Brett somebody asked if Brett wanted to come on the podcast. He did not want to come on the podcast. Then he wanted to go on Air Chat, but freaking Air Chat, I'm not interested in Air Chat because it's just monologuing slowly at each other. It's not a conversation. Like if you and I were to go on Air Chat, you would send me a 5-minute thing, and then I would listen to it, and then I would send you a 5-minute thing. But it's none of the like the back and forth, the repartee of conversation, So I was like, okay, if you want to do async, let's just do like a blog writing exchange. So then importantly, he said, okay, if you want to do that, you go first. I was like, all right, I'll totally go first. So then I wrote a thing and I posted it.
A 63-minute thing.
Just a tiny little 63-minute, 11,000 word thing. Yeah.
There's a lot of gems in there, though. There's a lot of...
well, and for the listener, it's like I make it unbelievably skimmable, so you can only read little chunks of it. You do not have to read the whole thing linearly. And I've just recently added even more tables of contents along the sides, so you can like skip, because it's so long. I kept like scrolling to the top, and it was really annoying. So I
subsection A, point 4, point 3, part 2.
But
refers to
I talk about freaking journal articles, whatever. But yes, I won't repeat any of the stuff there, but we'll obviously link to the blog post. But then what was so annoying is that I'm pretty sure Brett didn't even read it. He posted his blog in response 4 hours after mine, and it was clearly pre-written because he didn't refer to anything that I had said, which is, okay, if you want me to respond to you, then you should have gone first. This is how a blog exchange works. You listen to the other person, and then you respond to what the other person has said, and that's how a conversation moves forward. You don't just ignore it and then write something completely different. But what he wrote was like, I'll let the listeners just read it. But there was nothing new or interesting in there from my perspective. It was just repeating the word creativity a whole bunch. And his main point is like, if I predict, Ben, that you're going to go to the bathroom right now, because you're creative, you can say, well, I'm not going to go to the bathroom.
I'll pee my pants right here. Thank you very much.
But it fails to realize that all predictions about pretty much everything in science are probabilistic, so it's only ever statistical predictions. And also, it's just weird. Any place where the word creativity is in reference to prediction in Brett's essay, you can just replace it with agency. So because we have human agency, Ben, you are going to decide not to go to the bathroom or whatever, which just goes to show that the word creativity doesn't really mean anything in that context. It's just a placeholder word. So the listeners can read both of the posts and see what they think. But that was my kind of frustrated takeaway, which is like the whole point of critical rationalism and criticism and conversation is that you have to listen to the other person and then think about it. And so, yeah, just kind of showed me that you can like lead a horse to water, but you can't make him think. And that was kind of the frustrating, part of my week. So that was my summary and takeaway. What's your thoughts?
I agree with you. I think what was most disappointing to me was just an obvious lack of curiosity about this subject. So it was clear, like you said, the blog post was sort of pre-written and just hammered on about exactly what you'd expect if you fed this topic into an LLM trained on like Deutsch and stuff, right? Like, and that's not to say there's not some insight in creativity and in being skeptical of modeling, et cetera, much of which we've talked about before. But it's just clear that there was no interest in like investigating some nuances around this question, which I like. Even the blog post itself, I don't think is consistent on its own message. So in one sentence, he'll just reiterate that humans are creative. You can never make predictions about them. In the next sentence, he says, oh, sure. I mean, but some predictions are maybe obvious or whatnot. But right there, if you've said that, now you have to do you have to do some searching about, okay, what exactly demarcates good and bad predictions? And that's why I brought up law of supply and demand on the bottom of your post, right? Because there's something interesting at play there. And you can say the law of supply and demand is predictive about human behavior and how much people are willing to pay under conditions of scarcity, right?
Yeah.
And so, either you can just say that that's an invalid theory, which is fine. You can say that, but then you have to explain why that theory is so explanatory of so much of our economy, right?
Yeah.
And also then why Austrians prefer free market policies.
Exactly.
Right? Like, because it's typically undergirded by precisely that sort of logic. And, and then if you are willing to accept something like the law of supply and demand, then now there's an interesting question about, okay, exactly what predictions are cool and good and valid and reasonable and which ones aren't. And that is a very interesting question. And clearly there was no answer given to that question, which just demonstrates that there's no interest in trying to answer that question. And, it's not a sin to not be interested in various questions. That's fine. But then don't agree to write blog posts, exchange about the question, and then completely ignore your opponent's arguments. So it's just, for me, it's like, I don't know, people are entitled to their opinions, whatever. But there's just like the fundamental lack of curiosity is just kind of drives me nuts, right? Especially if you engage in this conversation, you obviously have strong opinions about it. And then to, write a totally vacuous blog post, there's something that's just, I think I told you in private, like there's just something about it that's like, you're just not an interesting conversation partner at that point. You're being a boring dinner guest. Like, just don't be boring, for fuck's sakes, man. Like, you can be wrong, but don't be boring. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think somewhere Orwell called ideologues gramophones because they just keep saying and repeating the same thing loudly.
Right.
And I was kind of reminded of that quote reading Brett's post, unfortunately. And so in the 11,000 word screed, I do try to wrestle with the question of like, sorry, it's not wrestling because Popper says explicitly what makes good predictions from bad predictions, but I'll let the reader kind of find that on their own. But yeah, so I kind of tease all that out, and it was just like, I also get the impression that, unfortunately, when Brett uses the phrase "good explanation," it's entirely arbitrary what he deems to be a good explanation and a bad explanation, with the exception of things that Deutsch have specifically said are good explanations. But he'll just declare things just completely ad hoc to be not good explanations and therefore not valid in science without an explanation, which is so ironic. And then further, his essay about human creativity seems to lack a lot of creativity. It was just very rote. And so I just hate to have to say this, but I just get this impression that these words are just kind of being used in kind of ideological ways now. One thing about that exchange that I realized is that you and I have been exploring these ideas over the last couple of years exclusively through the mechanism of like challenging each other. Like I say something, you question it, you push back. And so it's this constant debate / dialogue / discussion / exchange. But Brett's format is monologuing, and he only will talk to podcasters like Chris or Naval, who he knows in advance will agree with him or don't know Deutsch's work, so he can explain Deutsch's work. But when he's actually in the circumstance where is going to be challenged on his ideas, he seems to just flee. And this is so antithetical to like the critical rationalist spirit that it was just very disheartening for me to see that in someone who is such a prominent member of the community. It's like it's kind of like preaching Christianity in public and then being a Muslim at home or something. It's like if you're not going to live the stuff that you say, then it's just words. It doesn't matter, right? It's just words. And it was just clear to me that a lot of what he says is he's not living it, I guess, and that was disheartening.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, so with that, throw
not that we're frustrated, or
not that we're frustrated, but
I mean, but I mean, I think maybe it's worth underscoring that the frustration comes because he's such a clear and excellent expositor of Deutsch's ideas, right, and has rightfully gained a lot of respect in the CR community and among people who like Deutsch's work as a clear communicator of those ideas, and so there's a reason why you want to hold him to the high standard of always responding to criticism and being curious and displaying Popperianism, the attitude of Popperianism to a T, right? And so, so it's more that, I think because he's so excellent at what he does, we sort of held him to a very high standard. So it's just worth highlighting this, that, I guess. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's not,
Well, so with that, shall we switch back into? I'm so excited to go back to the Conjectures and Refutations series. It's been almost like 9 months, man. And,
what? Are you serious?
Yeah, I think it's been something like that. I looked at our last episode. It's been a while. So sorry, I'm going to grab a drink and let's get into it.
Booyah.
All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to another exciting Let me just try that shit again.
Exciting extolment of our virtues.
Yeah. All right. Welcome, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, young adolescents. I always realize adolescents get left out of that. They're just like the weird group that is
boys. They're just
boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen.
Still kind of children.
And then awkward pubescent adolescence. Welcome to Increments. My name is Vaden Masrani, UBC alumni in machine learning, and my boy, Mr. the fantastic, the excellent Benny Juniper Lovechild Chug from
I feel like I'm in a boxing match in the left ring.
I'm still trying to figure out a good flow for that. But so welcome to Increments. We are your hosts. Come support us on Patreon and Twitter and YouTube and Discord. Actually, don't support us on Discord. Just come join the Discord. Send us emails, write us reviews, all that good podcasting stuff. Am I forgetting anything?
Go walk around your neighborhood and tell people about us.
Yeah, just go. Yeah, walk up to someone and tell them to listen to the podcast. So today we are finally getting back to the Conjectures and Refutations series. It's been a while because of the amazing questions that have taken 9 months of our lives to. So we're doing chapter 8 from Conjectures and Refutations on the status of science and metaphysics. Part of the reason I was interested in doing this chapter is because it touches on one of our most recent interesting disagreements about whether all thought is problem solving, and in particular, the dimension of that argument, which was about the fact that that's an irrefutable claim. And so in this chapter, Popper addresses the question, essentially, can irrefutable theories still have merit? And this also applies a lot to our conversation with Brett Hall, because one argument for why Austrian economics doesn't need to make predictions is that it's a metaphysical theory. And that's just very clearly not an accurate representation of what Popper says about metaphysical theories. But for those two reasons, this chapter is kind of relevant to ongoing discussions. So there's a lot that I'll have to say on my side, but maybe I'll kick it over to you and just see if you want to do any throat clearing, setting it up, anything of that nature, and then we'll get into it.
No, I really enjoyed going through, especially the first part of this chapter and the history of Kant and his take on some of the history there, which I'm not sure is generally subscribed to. I think some of it he's reaching a bit. Like I tried to do some background research on some of his claims about Copernicus, etc. But regardless of whether he's correct, it makes for some very interesting reading, and it's a great way to frame the problem he's interested in. So yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter. It's short and to the point and very nice.
Yeah. So there's two sub components of this chapter. So the first one is titled Kant and the Logic of Experience. And we'll talk about that one, of course. And then the second one is the problem of the irrefutability of philosophical theories. So let's maybe go through both of these, but do you want to try to set it up?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Maybe let's just handle them separately, maybe. It's actually an interesting chapter because there's not a fully clear through
connection
line, I would say,
between
the two parts of the chapter. It's a little bit unclear why he's actually treating them in the same main chapter, but
on the status of science and metaphysics, right? So the first one is clearly about science, so Newton's theory. And then the second one is clearly about metaphysics. But I totally agree that there's not a clear connection between the two. Yeah. And I think a lot of this is just an artifact of the fact that Conjectures and Refutations is it's like a staple thesis where he's written a bunch of essays, written a bunch of papers, and then he kind of staples them together and then smooths it out to make it coherent. But each piece is basically a self-contained lecture. So I think it's an artifact of how it was written.
I mean, yeah, the title thing, I mean, you can always just take two disconnected things and say on this and this.
Yeah,
right? I don't view that as proof of a through line, but
No, I agree. It's not a through line. Yeah.
Okay, so the first part is dealing with, in Kant's time, the paradox of natural science. And he upholds Kant as sort of the first person to recognize this paradox. And one thing to note about Popper is he loves people who point out problems. So for him, the person who points out a problem or a paradox or just something we don't fully understand is almost equally as important, if not more so, than the person who actually solves the problem. So, he talks a lot about waking us from dogmatic slumbers and stuff like that. But you can just tell in Popper's writing, he loves people who kind of shook up the dominant paradigm of the time and asked what he views as to be an interesting question. And he doesn't actually fully describe the paradox until the end, but I think I'll just jump to it and then we can sort of go back and talk about the rest of it. But just to highlight where we're going to get to. So the situation at the time when Kant was writing, one has to remember that Newtonian mechanics was the dominant physical paradigm of the day. And not that it was just the dominant paradigm. Most educated people on the topic thought that it was true and it was absolute certainty and it described the world exactly how it was. They can be forgiven for thinking this, as Popper highlights, because at this point, Einstein had not showed up on the scene. And so what we had was this physical theory that seemingly came out of nowhere. It was mathematically precise and described observations within decimal places of accuracy. So there's sort of no reason for anyone to doubt that it was the true theory.
Yeah, just add one thing. And not only did anyone doubt that it was the true theory, but it was the first example of like a general piece of knowledge, like out of this like swirling myths and legends and biblical stories and Platonic stories and stuff. We, with Newton, finally had a set of equations that could tell you the trajectory of cannonballs, of the orbits of celestial bodies, of why, and not only that, but explains why the moon stays in the sky as well.
Right.
And so it was like this the first time where no one could doubt that we had finally achieved something like true knowledge. It was the first gem of knowledge that was not up for debate by anyone because of just how much it could explain and how much it could predict and how universally applicable it seemed to be. It wasn't just on Earth, but it applied to galaxies hundreds of billions of light years from here as well. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that it was like the first example of literal knowledge that we had.
Nice. And so given that we had this universal knowledge, natural question is, where the hell did this knowledge come from? How did we stumble upon this? Yeah. And Newton himself, according to Popper, asserted that he had come to this theory by induction. So he thought it could be logically derived from observations you can make about nature. And so basically you compile enough of these observations, and these observations point you irrevocably towards his theory. Okay. Yeah. So that's what Newton believed. And we'll get to criticisms with that in a second. But importantly, Kant didn't buy this.
Well, Hume proved it was not possible, right? Or proved it was not logically possible. So Newton believed it. Hume said, well, hold on a minute, fellas. I don't think this actually works. And then that's where Kant comes in. And I believe that's what Kant is referring to when he talks about being roused from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume. Hume pointing out all these logical problems with this idea that you could derive said knowledge from observation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Kant realized both historically that this was false, but also was persuaded by Hume that this just logically couldn't be the case. You can't get this general law from a number of observations. And we'll get into all that history in a second. Yeah. And so he took a much more Popperian line and sort of was a proto-Popperian in realizing that observation actually played sort of the opposite role. And you had to query nature for the answers you wanted. So observation sort of came after theory.
Can I just add one thing there? So I think it's actually would be a bit more accurate to say that Popper was a refined Kantian, in the sense that Popper's theory directly grew out of Kant's first attempt at trying to reconcile this. So just to kind of give credit where credit is due, where Popper fully recognizes that Kant is trying to grapple with the same problem that Popper eventually solves. So just
sure. Yeah. And so this gave rise to a bit of a paradox, right? So Hume on one hand is saying, wait. So we can't just observe finitely many things and then derive these general laws. But on the other hand, Newton was convinced we had arrived at certain truth, that Newtonian mechanics was certain truth and fully described the way the world is. And there was not really room for doubt there. So the paradox is, how the hell did we stumble on this thing? Yeah. Like we couldn't get it from observation. Where did we get it? And then if you know anything about Kant, you've probably heard about his like a priori, a posteriori distinction of knowledge, meaning a priori knowledge is sort of things that we get without interacting with the world, that we just have in our heads, and it comes from pure reason. And then a posteriori knowledge is stuff that we can get from observation.
And that's where prior and posterior comes from in Bayesian terminology as well. Prior before data, and posterior after the data.
And so his attempt at solving this problem was to say, okay, let's recognize that Hume is right about induction. So we didn't get this purely inductively. Instead, we come sort of pre-equipped with various notions. And these notions, typically he alluded to things like certain geometric truths, certain notions of causality, things like this. And what we do with these notions that are just in our head and represent true knowledge that we don't get by means of interacting with the world, what we do is we take these concepts and we put them onto nature, and we try and make nature fit these regularities that we have in our head, and then we sort of work with nature and then make something click. And then because these notions of geometry, causality, etc., are true, they do represent like true knowledge in our heads. Once we have something that sort of clicks with nature, in this sense, we can be sure that this is once we have a theory that's consistent with both this a priori knowledge in our head and that fits with nature, we can sort of be sure of its veracity. So this was sort of his attempt to solve this paradox about, how the hell did we generate Newtonian mechanics, and where did it come from? So that's sort of the setup to the first part of this chapter.
Yeah, well, great. Well, do you want to just keep going by saying how Popper modifies Kant's solution to arrive at his solution, and then we can backtrack? So the chapter is basically structured by giving three strong attacks against Newton's claim that he derived his theory from observation. And what I really like about this is that you kind of often hear critical rationalists and Popperians say induction is impossible. You don't get our knowledge from induction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's often lost, like, why that's the case. And so this is just a really nice way to kind of give a number of arguments as to why we can't possibly get our knowledge from induction in a very concrete, grounded fashion. So that's basically the first chunk of this chapter. And then he ends by setting up the problem that you just started with, and then kind of giving the refinement about how he would improve upon Kant's theory.
So I was going to go, maybe before we explain Popper's solution, let's introduce Einstein, because I think he's crucial to helping Popper arrive at his solution.
Yeah, nice.
And so 1914 or whatever, Einstein shows up on the scene and provides a theory that is equally consistent with all the observations that we have so far, namely of the orbits of planets and how objects fall, etc., but makes a different interpretation of these facts, right? So namely, he introduces the notion of a curved space-time and all of these things. He gets rid of this notion of forces, etc. So he can recover the predictions of Newtonian mechanics, but using an entirely different framework. And what Popper does here is he says, regardless of what you think about the truth of Einstein and his theory, everyone should be celebrating this, because what this has done is shown us that there's actually more than one theory that's consistent with all these sort of observations we've made so far. This is before we came up with a crucial test to differentiate between Newtonian mechanics and relativity. So this is before Eddington's experiment, right? So at this point, we had measured the velocity of things. We tried to measure gravitational constants, all this stuff. And then Einstein comes along and says, wait, there's actually a different way to interpret all of this. Yep. And it's in terms of mass and space-time and all these things we're now familiar with that fall under the umbrella of relativity. And Popper says this is actually a huge boon to the philosophical community. Right. So on one hand, this actually kind of, in some sense, proves that Newton couldn't have come about his theory inductively, because everything he observed is totally compatible with these two different theories. Right. Yeah. And so already this is a refutation. He'll get into more refutations, which we'll go through in a second. But already this is a refutation of his inductive claims. Right. Because he didn't come up with relativity, but relativity also explains everything that Newtonian mechanics explains and more. And then Popper sort of provides what presumably now is sort of familiar to lots of the audiences, the audience of this podcast, which is his theories of conjectures and refutations. Yeah. So he sort of discards the idea of a priori knowledge. I don't think he likes any of that. And he says, no, what's going on is we're coming up creatively with theories, we're guessing, and then our observations work as checks on these guesses and actually work to try and refute our theories.
So two comments there. So I'm trying to think of useful things the audience can have in their head to answer the question, why is induction not possible when asked at a bar? I think that's always kind of something that is my guiding principle. Nice. Like, how can I explain this to people at bars? And so one thing is what you just said, and which is what in my little rewrite of Popper's disproof of probabilistic induction, he relies upon, which is that for any given set of observations, there's an infinite number of possible generalizations from those observations one can obtain. And so they could include the true generalizations, like, so say Einstein's theory, if it's true, obviously we couldn't know that. But it could also include Einstein's theory plus the assumption that it's a bunch of little angels that are moving the curving spacetime. So Einstein's theory plus angels would also be a theory that you could derive from observations, because you could derive anything that's consistent with the set of observations. And that's kind of the little trick that Popper uses in his probabilistic disproof, is just showing that if you have a set of generalizations, the probability calculus doesn't change the order in which you prioritize these generalizations. And therefore, there's no way to privilege the quote, the good one from the bad one. So that's just a one little easy one-liner that you could use at a bar. But I just want to read a quote that I think we've read the podcast before. It comes from chapter 3, either chapter 2 or chapter 3, titled The Nature of Philosophical Problems. And he's referring to exactly Kant's solution, where Kant says that we get these general laws because we have this inbuilt structure in our head. And to this, Popper says, well, then according to Kant's theory, natural science isn't only possible, but it's actually the necessary result of our mental outfit. So Newton's laws, rather than being some miraculous thing, were just a necessary consequence of our inbuilt structure. And that seems obviously kind of absurd. So his refinement is this. I'm just going to read this quote because I think it's beautiful. So the question is, how are successful conjectures possible? And so just like you said, that's what Popper. That's kind of Popper's big insight, refining on Kant, is introducing this idea of conjectures. And then the question is, well, how are these conjectures possible? And he says, because as you've said, Kant, we are not passive receivers of sense data, but active organisms, because we react to our environment not always merely instinctively, but sometimes consciously and freely, because we invent myths and stories and theories, because we have a thirst for explanation, an insatiable curiosity, a wish to know, because we not only invent stories and theories, but we try them out and see whether they work and how they work. Because by a great effort, by trying hard and making many mistakes, we may sometimes, if we are lucky, succeed in hitting upon a story, an explanation, which saves the phenomena, perhaps by making up a myth about invisibles, such as atoms or forces, which explain the visible. Because knowledge is an adventure of ideas. These ideas, it is true, are produced by us, and not by the world around us. They are not merely the traces of repeated sensations or stimuli or whatnot. Here, you were right. But we are more active and free than even you believed, for similar observations or similar environmental situations do not, as your theory implies, produce similar explanations in different men. Nor is the fact that we create our theories and that we attempt to impose them upon the world an explanation of our success, as you believe. For the overwhelming majority of our theories, of our freely invented ideas, are unsuccessful. They do not stand up to searching tests, and they're discarded as falsified by experience. Only a few of them succeed for a time in the competitive struggle for survival. So here you just see Popper's epistemology in 2 paragraphs, and see how it's a beautiful refinement on Kant's first attempt at this solution.
Which one can only imagine probably would have relieved Kant to some extent. He seemed sort of troubled by this paradox, and I think the recognition that Newtonian mechanics wasn't certain truth, that we can never arrive at absolutely certain truth, may have it possibly would have sent him down the irrationality rabbit hole like it did to Hume, but one would hope that it would actually have relieved him, and he would have become Popper before Popper was Popper. Yeah, well,
I honestly think that Popper couldn't have arrived at his solution had Einstein not come around.
No, exactly. He's crucial.
Because without Einstein, I think it would have been hard to recognize that you can never have certain truth, right? You needed to have the overthrow of something that seemed to be certain to have that insight. And so it's this interesting example of how there is not actually a big gulf between science and philosophy. And they feed back in on each other when done correctly, of course. But we shouldn't just siphon off the world into different disciplines. It's all related. Yep.
Yeah. And also how reasonable questions change over time, which I thought was interesting, right? Like you said before Einstein, it was very reasonable to actually assume that we had sort of stumbled on this final true theory. And then to wonder about that, like, how the fuck did we do this? This is crazy. Something like a priori knowledge now sounds a little, I actually don't know what like philosophers think of it now. They're probably still debating it.
Well, you call it like DNA or whatever, right? I think that's what Deutsch would say.
Yeah, but I think in terms of like certain like concepts, like, geometry, this sort of a priori abstract knowledge that we're carrying around in our head. I don't think many people subscribe to that now.
Yeah, I agree.
But it would, and so it's easy to, I think, read Kant now and say, this is fucking nuts. Like, how would you ever think this? But you're forgetting what was happening at the time, right? And so it's a very reasonable theory given the problem situation, as it were, at the time.
Yeah. Nice. So we're kind of skipping around in this chapter, but I think it's still I think it's coherent. But so then the first part of the first section of the chapter is where Popper just takes a giant fucking sledgehammer to the idea that Newton's theories were derived from induction. And so he says the following, that the assertion that Newton's theory was derived from observation will be criticized here on 3 counts. First, the assertion that it's not intuitively credible. Second, it's that it's false, historically false. And third, that it's logically false. It's a logically impossible assertion. So let's go through each of these. Kick it off, Betty boy.
Baby. All right. So it's not intuitively credible is objection number 1. And I think going back to your bar point, this is another good one to bring up.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. This is great. Yeah.
And so it's intuitive. So observations are inexact, right? When you're observing things in nature, first of all, you have finitely many observations of whatever phenomena you're witnessing. Second of all, observations always take place within a specific context. And so, it's like an apple falling from your tree in your front yard. You don't witness abstract apples falling from all trees simultaneously.
Yeah.
So they're very concrete things that are happening in very specific circumstances. And you're not witnessing, for instance, the same precision that you get with something like Newtonian mechanics as a predictive theory. So you're not witnessing what's the actual gravitational constant that's causing this apple to fall. How precisely fast is this apple falling? How long did it take it to fall from the tree to the ground? Whereas, of course, physical theories, one, they apply everywhere. So whereas observations only occurred in a specific time, at a specific time and place, a good physical theory will tell you what's happening everywhere. And the precision obviously goes far beyond anything we can observe. And also, a theory posits things, like you were saying earlier, it posits to explain the seen by the unseen. So it typically posits things you don't observe, namely forces and something like the gravitational constant, et cetera, things which are not part of the actual observation at all.
Is there, just because you know logic much better than I, is there a principle of logic that says...
You hear that, audience? I am the king of logic. Whenever we disagree in the future, remember that. He's admitted I'm more logical than him.
That's something I'll just edit out, but yeah. But is it a principle of logic that you can't derive something that's like more precise from something that's vague? Obviously, you can derive things that are more specific from things that are more general, of course. But how does that map onto the fact that observations are imprecise and local, but yet a theory claims to be precise and global? Is there any... So I think Popper puts this in the it's not intuitively credible section, not in the logically false section. So I'm assuming this isn't a principle of logic. It's just more like a common sense thing. But is there any principle of logic that would get close to that or no?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I think it's, but to be honest, I think it's the same principle that you can't get a generality from a bunch of specifics, right? In some sense, it's the same thing going on where you have like a bunch of vague statements and you can't make things more, in some sense, a conclusion of a logical argument is always weaker than what you started with, right? Because you're saying that certain premises lead you to a certain conclusion. So in some sense, the conclusion's always weaker than the premises that you started with, right? And so it's something like that, where you start with vagueness. You can't magically get something that's super precise. But the actual instantiation of that logically, I'm not sure what that would look like.
Yeah. Just to reiterate that. So he says, what's of the utmost importance is that we can never, I repeat, never observe anything like Newtonian forces, which is just a great and simple point. Like the theory of Newton's includes things we can't observe. So how could we possibly derive such a theory from observations if it, by definition, includes things that can't be observed? And so, so just returning to the hypothetical conversation with somebody at a bar, why is induction impossible? Well, make it specific, talk about Newton, and then just talk about what is actually being claimed here. And it doesn't make any sense. And I think this is why Hume was so troubled by it.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And just the other another point is that when we actually make measurements, so if we're trying to measure forces or measure accelerations or measure run tests to test Newton's first, second, and third law, which are all predictive and falsifiable and statistically falsified. I just want to emphasize, because there's a bit of a statistics phobia within the crit rat community, from what I can tell. So I want to break us crit rats of a phobia of statistics, please. And so whenever we run these experiments, we always, without exception, presuppose the truth of the theory under question. So it can't be that you run the experiments to learn the truth, because you only run the experiments assuming that the theory is true itself. And that is a big problem for those who say that we run these experiments and we observe the results in order to learn the truth probabilistically or otherwise. It's always assumed to be true, and then we try to falsify it. But you can't just start with a non-assumption of truth before you run these experiments, because you wouldn't know what experiment to run if you didn't already assume the theory was true.
Yeah, interesting. This one I've always had like a bit of trouble with, because there's such a thing as sort of like an exploratory analysis, right? And this isn't to say it's devoid of all sorts of theory, but often, like, if you get a data set, you're wondering exactly what analyses to run. This isn't to say your mind is some sort of blank slate and then you look at the data and it's telling you what analyses to run. That never happens. Yeah. But you don't always have the precise theory in mind, I think, when, say, you're looking for data and wondering, like, okay, exactly what model am I going to run in order to test causality here or something.
Well, I think you always do have a little like micro problem in mind that you're trying to check for, right? Like,
I agree, but it doesn't necessarily presuppose the eventual theory that you're going to be testing, right?
No, it's more just like
you can be inspired in some sense by looking at data, right? I guess that's my point. Like,
for sure. Yeah, for sure.
You can have like an analysis plan, like, just take it out of the realm of physics, but like you can have an analysis plan in like statistics or data science, look at the data and say, oh shit, you know what? This actually looks more like Poisson data or something than a model that's going to be fit by, say, like linear regression. And then that kind of gives you the idea, oh shit, okay, maybe I should sort of do a Poisson analysis here. And so in some sense, like, I kind of know what people are getting at by like, oh, you look at the data first and then that tells you what to do. It's not true, because, you know, you have to know about something like Poisson regression beforehand. And like, it's all your observations are still, you're trying to solve some micro problem at any point in time, plotting the response against the predictors, whatever. But
I think Popper would never say that data and observation can't be a source of inspiration. Absolutely can be a source of inspiration, without question. The natural world is a great source of inspiration. It's just that it's not the thing which allows you to derive logically the truth of the theory. But 100% it can be a source of inspiration. Everything can be a source of inspiration. So
yeah, I agree. I think that somehow gets lost sometimes in Popperian circles, where it's like data is always completely secondary, and it almost doesn't matter sometimes. You know exactly what you're going to do, and then you just check. The data is just for checking. But
100%.
The data can provide. It can supply problems. It can give you insights into things. Like
absolutely agree. Yeah, absolutely. So then his second sledgehammer blow against this claim, against the claim of inductive science, is by historically going through the chain of events that led to Newton's theory in the first place. And I found this to be super fascinating, as did you, Ben, and you said that you did some background research, and maybe some of it doesn't check out, but I think the main claims do. But yeah, so just tell me what you've picked up.
Yeah. First I should say that I liked this section. I wasn't quite sure what he was getting at, though, because he doesn't actually talk about Newton directly. He talks about Newton's predecessors and how they sort of came up with their theories. And it wasn't clear to me that he was refuting that Newton came up with his theory by means of induction here. He was like talking about the historical lineage of ideas that led up to Newton, right?
Well, it took me a second, right? But remember his bigger claim from actually the chapter 2, the quote that I read, right? So he's going to say that no, it's not that Newton gets his theories from observation. It's that he gets his theories from previous myths and previous ideas. And so what he's going to do is talk about the changing of myths and ideas that have started from Plato and gone through to Copernicus, Brahe, and Kepler, and then from Kepler to Newton. And so how each person didn't start from observations, but started by refining the thing that came before. And so he's talking about how it's not that Newton got his theory from observations, is that he got it from refinement of myths and ideas and falsifications of ideas that have come in the past. And that's the through line connection, which took me a second to get, but I got it on rereading. So
nice. Okay, so Popper starts with Copernicus. And I think the story of Copernicus, as it's typically told, is something like at that point, there was the Ptolemaic model where the sun revolved around the earth. And then Copernicus came along, spotted some flaws in the data, and then used those flaws to observe that the Earth revolves around the sun.
Well, no, that proposed, right? So the observations wouldn't have changed, because I think that they didn't have telescopes and astronomy equipment until Kepler came around. But So the observation of the sun wouldn't have changed, right? You still observe the sun in the same place. It's that the model that was proposed from Copernicus puts the sun in the center of the solar system rather than the Earth.
Wait, sorry, what did I say?
You said that Copernicus observed that the sun was in the center of the Earth, or the center of the solar system.
Oh, no, but yeah, I guess I meant observe. Sorry, yeah, I meant that he was inspired by these observations to put forth the model. So Popper sort of takes issue with this on two fronts. The first, which I think is sort of indisputable, is that when Copernicus originally suggested his model, the actual observations that people had of various orbits were actually consistent with both the Copernican model and the Ptolemaic model. Mm-hmm. And so there was no reason immediately to actually say, oh, Ptolemy's model is wrong and Copernicus is right. We actually just had like two theories and a consistent set of observations for both. Which is typically not how the story is told, which I thought was pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. And that does seem to check out. And so that leads you to ask the question, well, okay, if Ptolemy's model was consistent with the observations we had at that point, why did Copernicus feel the need to generate this new model? Like what exactly was going on here? Popper claims that it was because Copernicus had an attachment to various Platonic ideals. So he was a student of Plato, and in particular, Plato proposed these hierarchies of things based on how they correspond to certain abstract categories. So we have like the idea of the good and or the realm of ideas, and the idea of the good, and the good is the highest thing. It occupies the highest position in the realm of ideas. Similarly, there's the realm of like things in nature. And I think the sun, according to Plato, sort of occupies the highest spot in the hierarchy of visible things in nature. Mm-hmm. That's probably off in some sense how I've described it, but I think that's roughly the idea. And so there's these hierarchies of things, of beings, mm-hmm. of ideas, of physical things. And so Copernicus, being a Platonite or a Platonist, I guess, actually wanted to put the sun in the center of the model because he mm-hmm. thought everything should sort of subordinate itself to the sun in some sense. Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting idea. And I looked it up, and it doesn't seem to be well subscribed. So it seemed to be subscribed by Popper and Kuhn. They both thought this was true. There doesn't seem to be much textual evidence in Copernicus's actual writing, so he doesn't really reference Plato at all.
So it's obviously it's a conjecture.
Yeah, it's a conjecture. Popper sort of wrote it as this is he sort of wrote it like this is what happened, which I just want to be clear is kind of, I think it's in dispute, if not sort of a very peripheral sort of theory.
Yeah, maybe what we should say is there's no textual evidence of this, but maybe I'm just too Popperian or whatever, but it seems to be decently plausible to put yourself in the mind of Copernicus and think like, reading all this old philosophy, Plato says the sun is the best, it's the most important, and just from there say, well, fuck it, let's just put it in the middle. Like that doesn't, like let's just put it in the middle because it's the very best, and let's just see what happens with that. Like how much writing would have been around at the time of Copernicus? I would bet that Plato and Plato's writing would be like the main thing next to perhaps the Bible, right?
Well, then you'd think he would have referenced it a lot, right?
Well, it would be in the pool of ideas that are just in the background of his mind that there's not like a lot of competition, presumably, because you didn't have. So Copernicus was around in 1473. So when was the printing press? I think just maybe 1415 or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. Not that much.
So there's not a huge set of ideas to choose from. And so if one of them is saying that the sun is the highest status amongst the visible things, it doesn't seem to be a big stretch to say that that's where he got some of his inspiration. But yeah, let's just be clear that there's no textual evidence for that. So yeah. But okay, so that's Popper's claim, which I'm willing to take. But let's just be clear that there's not historical backing for that. But his main point is that's the source of the inspiration. And even if it's not that, it can't be just observations because observations are consistent with both models.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I found most interesting. Yeah. Like the inspiration came from somewhere. Maybe it was Plato, maybe it wasn't. But the fact that like he proposed this model, which was at that point consistent, and he had to do much more work to show that, oh, okay, the Ptolemaic model is actually wrong and making different predictions, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. That all came after the fact, which I thought was fascinating. So then he goes to Kepler. So let's just remind ourselves. So Copernicus came first. He was born in 1473.
Then the next major astronomer was Tycho Brahe, 1546. And it was Brahe's assistant, Kepler, who developed the model of, I forgot what you call it, but ellipsoidal. Yeah. Ellipses. So Brahe's big contribution was he was quite diligent in taking a lot of copious notes about astronomy. And Kepler was the one who actually invented the first telescope. That's correct, right? Yes. So just on Wikipedia, so he
invented an improved version.
Yeah. Okay. So he did work on telescopes, and so he just invented better observation tools. So what's the point here? So keep in mind, listener, that Popper's main meta point is that we get our theories not from observations, but from refining and mutating and recombining previous ideas, previous legends, previous myths. So Kepler is basically the assistant of Brahe, and he's given just a giant textbook of Brahe's observations. And what is he trying to do? He's trying to validate the Copernicus's model, which says that all celestial bodies orbit in perfect circles. And so he's pouring through these observations, and what he's finding is that it just doesn't fit. It's not working. So it's not that the observations are producing his theory, it's that it's actually falsifying his theory, because he's trying to get the circle theory to fit when it's not fitting. So then Popper says, in vain, Kepler then tries the next simplest thing. So if it can't be circles, what about ellipses? And finds, lo and behold, that ellipses do fit the data. So this is a clear example not of data inducing your theory, but of data disconfirming the theory that you wanted, and now you have to propose something else that better fits the data. And so that was kind of the big takeaway I got from the Brahe-Kepler section, but perhaps you got some extra stuff there too.
No, that was great. Yeah.
Amazing. So then the way that this connects to Newton is quite fascinating, and I love this little nugget, is that Kepler's theories, if you believe that, say, the Earth is orbiting the sun in a giant ellipse, like what's keeping the Earth from just on orbit? There has to be some sort of, I'm going to quote Popper directly here, a cause, a power, emanating like light rays from the sun, an influence, a steering, or a causal force. But what's so fascinating to me is that Kepler and Newton really resisted this idea, because this is directly coming from astrology. Astrology kind of has this principle that there's like some powerful force from the celestial bodies that influence the what goes on Earth. And so Popper says, so this is why Newton was so reluctant to accept his own theory of attraction, and why he was never quite reconciled to it. And this is why the French Cartesians were so long unwilling to accept Newton's theory. But in the end, the originally astrological view proved so successful that it was accepted by all rationalists, and its disreputable origins were forgotten. So how does this connect? So this connects because Newton then gives a theory as to why planets stay on their orbits, thus explaining the conjectured theory of Kepler. Further, Newton's theory is a refinement of astrological myths, and it's a really nice example of even something like astrology can lead to, through mutation and refinement, can lead to scientific thought. And so that's kind of the through line from Copernicus, Brahe, Kepler to Newton. They're all refining and mutating and warping and building and trying to refute the theories and the myths that have come before it. And that's the historical legacy of where Newton actually got his ideas, modulo some of the missing textual evidence, which you rightly pointed out.
It's also a good example of someone not having to believe the theory themselves for the theory to be good and valid, right? So, he sort of reluctantly proposed this, and it ended up being the dominant theory for a long time, despite him not believing it. So so the idea that the scientist has to be fully committed to the theory before they expound it is nicely contradicted by the story. So maybe the final thing is that, so we've talked about two of the criticisms. The final criticism that Popper brings up that Newton used induction to define his theory is the logical criticism, but it's just he's pointing out Hume's criticism here and just saying that Hume basically proved the impossibility of doing this. It's probably not worth trying to do this in speech, so I think we'll just leave this for listeners if they're logicians at heart and want to discover this on their own. But
yeah, I'll just make a few meta comments. This section, I think, is valuable if you want to try to find a simpler version of Hume's argument. I think he tries to simplify Hume's argument, but it's still decently dense, and I think it's only really of interest for the deep logicians. But interesting, worth scanning. I don't think it's terribly worth talking about on the pod. It's just let us define K to be the class of statements, and let us define the statement B to be. So it's all that kind of stuff, which is required if you're going to do a proper logical treatment, but it's not the most interesting thing to say out loud.
Yeah.
So to maybe conclude, this is a great chapter to read if you really want to fill up your quiver with arguments as to explicitly why we can't derive our theories from observation, as well as have a nice story in the background about how we actually do get our theories, the story of where Newton's theories came about. And so then he pivots in kind of a not super connected way to part 2 of the chapter called The Problem of the Irrefutability of Philosophical Theories. And yeah, just to set this up, when we were arguing about whether or not all thoughts are problem solving, Ben rightly pointed out that claim is completely irrefutable. And so that poses an interesting question, right? Because to the scientist, if you say something is irrefutable, then it's basically saying it's like, come back to me when you have something irrefutable, bro, which is totally legit. But things like all science comes from conjecture and criticism is arguably irrefutable too. And many philosophical theories are irrefutable, but yet we don't say that they're all worthless. So the question that he's trying to grapple with here is, when do we say that a irrefutable theory is false? When can we say it's true? And when can we say it's even just like worthwhile? Maybe the truth value is unclear, but it's still worth pursuing. And so that's kind of what he's going to wrestle with in this chapter. That's kind of my setup, but perhaps you want to add extra stuff.
Maybe I'll say that in this chapter, he takes the irrefutability of certain theories at face value. So he breaks theories into 3 kinds. Says there can be logical / mathematical theories, can be sort of empirical scientific theories, and then there can be philosophical and metaphysical theories. The latter of these, philosophical and metaphysical theories, he says these are typically of the irrefutable kind. So they're just like sort of broad general claims that typically there's no observation you could point to that would refute these. So you can think of often like moral theories are in this category. Many religious claims are in this sort of category. Popper uses determinism as one of his favorite examples. Nihilism is another one. Idealism, solipsism, these kind of things, right? So broadly, philosophical theories, you can't just point to a state of the world that would tell you whether this is true or false. And he takes theories as given and then treats and then puts them into one of these categories. There's an interesting related but separate question about precisely how you should classify a theory and whether you should try and make an irrefutable theory refutable. So one thing you pointed out in your blog post on Austrianism is that economic theory should strive to be refutable, right? So it's actually not good to take pride in the fact that your economic theory is a metaphysical theory and can't be refuted by any observable state of the world. This says something bad about the theory. Some theories can't get around this fact, and that's often fine, as Popper's going to argue. But insofar as you can, you should strive to make your theory refutable. And then I think that actually ties into more of our disagreement. And I think I was trying to say the theory, all thoughts are problem solving, is you should be striving to make that theory refutable. And I think you were saying, no, this is a theory that firmly belongs in the realm of the metaphysical, and that's fine. And I was saying, no, I was saying, one, I'm not even sure this is a metaphysical theory. I think sometimes you're making empirical claims that can be falsified. And then I felt like you were, when I would say that, then you would say it's just a metaphysical theory, but then you would make certain empirical claims. And I think, and so we worked that out in the episode, but that was my initial reaction. And that's what what got my hackles up so much.
No, totally.
You can't just pick and choose which bucket your theory's in, right? And moreover, you should be trying to make as many of your theories as possible empirical or refutable by logic, mathematics, or observation. And so I think that was part of the. I think that was a big part of the disagreement. Like, what bucket is this theory in, and what bucket should this theory be in? And I think we had disagreements along those lines.
Yeah, nice. So let me totally go down that path a little bit, because I think that's excellent, because that's absolutely something I called the Austrians out for. And if there's any trace of that in my previous argument, then I want to try to abolish that. So one way that I think we could start trying to make the all thoughts problem solving theory refutable is by starting to split up the word problem into different kinds of categories. So let's talk about like explicit conscious thoughts. So let's define the set of what we call problems to be like explicit. Like if you were to say, Vaden, what problem are you working on right now? Could I write that down? Right. And I think that that would make it much more falsifiable. So I think that you could just poll me. And I think that it's pretty much true to say, yes, that I am always trying to solve the problem in that explicit sense. Whereas for you, maybe that's not the case. And therefore, that would be a totally falsified theory that way. And so I think it's better to try to make it falsifiable. And if we're going to think about the problem that way, then that's a falsified theory. But at least leads to some more interesting ideas. Like, for whom is it true to say that they are always thinking about problems? And for whom is it true to say that they're not? And so that theory be falsified, and then we can start making a bit more progress. But I think we could still also take the second line, which is, okay, if we're going to view problems to be disappointed expectations in the most general possible sense, then let's just call that version of the theory number 2, which is irrefutable, because we've just defined problem to be so wide. And now, given that sense, is there even any value in doing that? Like, is it always a waste of time, or is there some value? And I'll just say in my own life that I do find that valuable. What's an example? So I view little Georgia as always trying to solve little problems, right? And there was a moment a couple weeks ago where she was asking for food, but I was like, I don't think she's actually hungry. I think it's just a little problem-solving mind, and that was just like a little aspect of boredom. And so instead of giving her food, I suggested we start tidying the toys instead. And she was super happy to do that, and we just started tidying the toys. And then she like learned the new skill of putting her toys away, right?
So you didn't let her eat, and instead you made her clean. Hey, this is okay.
Hilarious. Yeah, that's a great way to rephrase it. You will get food after you've mopped the floors. But okay, so that's just me thinking, okay, maybe she's not literally hungry right now. This is her little problem-solving mind, because she's always trying to solve problems. Let's just give her a different, interesting problem to solve instead. So viewing her little mind as always solving problems just gave me a different way to suggest a new kind of behavior, and she picked up a new skill, hopefully. So in that sense, version of that theory 2, which is the more irrefutable, widely defined version, is there still value in it? And I would want to claim yes. But if it was possible to make the widely all problems are just disappointed expectations theory, if it's possible to make that falsifiable, then fucking let's do it. Like, that's absolutely important to do. I'm not clever enough to figure out how to do that. But that's maybe how I would approach that, and what I would want to see from the Austrians, the similar kind of willingness to refine and improve their theories, such that they can be irrefutable, or they can be refuted, or they can change a little bit. And that's kind of the spirit in which I'm hoping they will engage in the challenge that I laid out in that post.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, can I add one thing? So I just want to give a bit of the structure of the chapter, because we're skipping some stuff, but I think that's probably okay to give the listener Popper's kind of main point, where he sets up the chapter by saying he's going to discuss 5 irrefutable theories. I'll just go through the list. So determinism, idealism, irrationalism, the idea that we can never know the world at all. And so the best thing we can do is use like feelings and emotions. And this is kind of the romantic. So romanticism is a dirty word when viewed through Enlightenment rationality, because the romantics were the ones who were like, just do away with your reason, just run out into the fields and become one with nature. And it led to like romantic movies and like romance novels and all that. That's all fine and good. That's just cool literature. But at the time, it was proposed as you should follow your emotions and your gut, And if you love war and violence, that's an emotion too. Just follow that. Do away with reason. And so that's kind of the irrationalism that he's describing. Volunteerism, which is Schopenhauer's philosophy, which Popper tries to steal man, and I still don't fucking understand anything.
Yeah, I don't understand. Yeah, I was hoping. I was like,
I'm not even going to attempt it. He just Schopenhauer's philosophy about everything is will. The listener can read it. I'm not going to attempt. And then nihilism, that life is boring, everything sucks, and there's no point to anything. And so what he says is, while he's convinced that all 5 of these theories are irrefutable, he's also convinced that all 5 of them are false. So that's how I kind of feel about Austrianism, to be honest, although I don't know enough of the details. But just my smell, based purely on my smell test and gut feels, that's kind of where I'm at with Austrianism. But that's neither here nor there. And so that's the main subject that he motivates this with, is how can he simultaneously say something is irrefutable and also say it's false? And then more interestingly, how can we say, well, what value do irrefutable theories have? So there's kind of the two sides of the coin. And I don't think we're going to go through the details of his arguments against each of these. I'll just make a comment on the determinism one. So his main mistake with all of his critiques about determinism is he conflates it with predictability. And his criticism of determinism is that, well, this would mean that you could predict the Einstein's theories based on the state of his brain. But as soon as chaos theory was invented in the 50s and 60s, that just completely destroys his arguments, because we now know that there are many deterministic systems. In fact, most deterministic systems are not predictable by definition, because of the infinite sensitivity to initial conditions. So his arguments against determinism fall for that, because he wasn't aware of chaos theory. But the rest of it, I'm on board with. And so we'll let the listener just read the chapter to get his arguments about that, because those are basically just serving as examples to make his claims concrete. But I think the heart of his philosophical arguments are what we'll focus on.
Okay, so just to spell out the problem in Popper's words, here's a paragraph that sort of sums up the question he's grappling with in the chapter. He says, listening to this statement, you may well wonder, I guess I should say, the statement he's referring to is that philosophical and metaphysical theories are irrefutable. And then he says, listening to this statement, you may well wonder how I can possibly hold a theory to be false and irrefutable at one and the same time. I, who claim to be a rationalist. For how can a rationalist say of a theory that it is false and irrefutable? Is he not bound, as a rationalist, to refute a theory before he asserts that it is false? And conversely, is he not bound to admit that if a theory is irrefutable, it is true? Okay, so should we just dive into his arguments, or
how
do you want to do this?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing he points out, very briefly, but I thought it was a good point, is sort of handles his last question there. Is someone not bound to admit that if a theory is irrefutable, it is true? And he points out that if a theory T is irrefutable, it's often the case, not always, but most often, that the negation of T is also irrefutable. So theories sort of stay in the same category, and they're closed under they're closed under their inverses, and they stay in the same category. So just think of like a religious theory here, maybe, right? Like both the claims and the anti-claims pertaining to that religion are often irrefutable.
Yeah, atheism is as irrefutable as deism.
Yeah, exactly. And same with moral theories, etc. So irrefutability cannot be held as the standard by which we believe a theory, or we think a theory is true, since this would have you believing all sorts of contradictory theories at once, right? We'd be believing T and minus T and basically all irrefutable theories at one and the same time. And so this would just lead to a totally incoherent worldview, which I thought was a good point. Okay. Do you want to talk about the main meat of his argument? Yeah.
Okay. So going back to his tripartite structure, logical theories, which are refuted typically logically by pointing out contradictions. So that's mathematics in particular. Empirical theories, which are refuted by looking at empirical statements. So I say that Argentina is going to be great in 4 years, and then it looks pretty fucking terrible in 4 years. And that would be kind of a refutation of Austrianism. Obviously, I'm being very, very vague, but that's just a coarse example. And then metaphysical theories, what's the gap? Like, how you can't use logic and you can't use empirical results. But what he says is that all three of these, you can use criticism, and it's about trying to examine these theories critically. And so, yes, while you cannot refute a irrefutable theory, you can absolutely argue against it. And what this means is that after many arguments for and against a theory, one has to make a conjecture. You either are going to have to conjecture if it's true or if it's false. You have to assume it. So use the word conjecture, just say you're either going to assume one of these theories is true and the other is false because there's nothing else you can do. And so to say that an irrefutable theory is both irrefutable and false is to simply say that it is more reasonable to assume the theory is false than it is to assume that the theory is true after a long period of critical argumentative discussion, basically. And so the thing that unifies all three of those prongs, the three of the classes of theories, is that all of them can be thought about critically. And while we cannot logically say or empirically say some are the first two are false, we can absolutely say that it is more reasonable to assume it is false than to assume it is true after said critical discussion. And that to me is just a great point and completely, from my mind, resolves the question of how can you both simultaneously say it's irrefutable and false?
Yeah. And just to make this very concrete, I mean, while you don't have purely logical means or empirical means at your disposal, just think of the sort of debates you get in with like your family and friends all the time. So you can still always ask such questions. This is quoting Popper now. We can still always ask such questions as, does it solve the problem? Problem here is just referring to whatever problem the theory was trying to solve in the first place. Does it solve it better than other theories? Maybe it's just shifted the problem. Is the solution simple? Is it fruitful? Does it perhaps contradict other theories that we need for solving certain other problems? So there's still lots of argumentative tools at your disposal that you can always use to grapple with the situation. And another good point you bring up to tie it back to your blog post again is this distinction between logic and argument, right? And so some types of theories lend themselves to logical arguments, and certain arguments are in themselves logical. But if you don't have not everything is logic, and I think the way you put it in your blog post, logic is it's a nice to have, right? Not a must have. And so it's not as if once you don't have a logical theory for something, you're just at a complete dead end and we can no longer discuss anything or talk about anything, right? We can always just still argue about it and talk about its consequences, whether we want those consequences, whether it solves the problem, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just talk about the blog post and go on a little hobby horse moment for a second? Because this completely gets rid of the stupid is-ought distinction, entirely. So Sam Harris has his attack on the is-ought distinction. It's completely consistent with Deutsch's, and kind of my version of it is just to recognize that the is-ought distinction is entirely a logical problem where, so for listeners who maybe don't know what the is-ought distinction is, if you Google it or you talk to any ethical philosopher, any EA person, or now any Austrian, I've learned as well, like to use this.
Actually, defend EA for a second. I think EA is actually better at this than most other people.
Okay. So, I'll take it. I'll take your clarification. I'll take your clarification. They say you can't get an ought from an is. So what they mean is there's from the statements, this is what I use in the blog post. The house is on fire. There is a child in that house. We ought to save the child. The ought is distinction. What people say is there's no way to get what you should do, that we ought to save the child, from what is happening, that the child is about to burn to death. And you'll always hear people say, you can't get it. You can't reason. There's no rational way to get there. And all of that is fucking wrong. The only thing you can't do is logically entail the ought. So you can't say, claim 1, the house is on fire. Claim 2, there's a child in the house. Conclusion, therefore we ought to save the child. So the logic doesn't work. You can't logically bridge that gap. But logic is a nice to have. It's not a freaking need to have. And so if you just view it as an argument, instead of a logical thing, it's just the house is on fire. There's a child in the house. I think we should save that child. That's completely 100% fine. So the whole ought is thing is entirely due to the word get. So it's about the word get. And people forget that get specifically means logical entailment. And in popular discussion, they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, there's no way to get it. It's like, yes, there is. You argue it, you think about it, you get it in the same way you get any other idea that you have. The only thing you can't have is logical entailment, but you don't need logical entailment most of the time. Logical entailment, even if I logically disprove Brett's claim that it's impossible to make predictions about human behavior, which I did because it's a trivial thing to logically disprove, people aren't going to listen to you anyways. So they're just going to treat it as like another argument. So it's not like logic is magically going to save the day. Logic only works with people who respect it. And you have to have a whole culture and tradition of logic, people respecting logic. And that's what mathematics is and the sciences are. And I'll actually go further and to say that probably the softer the science, the less it respects logical argument. And from what I can tell, the Austrian school, people who have been debating, don't respect logical argument at all when it's used on them. They only like to use it on other people, which means it's a very soft science because they're not respecting logical claims when they're presented against their own views.
We're really pissing a lot of people off in this episode.
Yeah. Well,
this might be our last one.
Yeah. There's 2 blog posts, which everyone can read, and you can see why I'm so annoyed. And they have been completely unresponded to. And so that's why I'm kind of annoyed. This is like, if you're going to freaking say you're a critical rationalist, then respond to criticism, people. If you're going to, or stop calling yourself critical rationalist because you're not walking the walk. So that's why I'm annoyed. But
I have an interesting question for you, or at least I think it's an interesting question, which is that, so in terms of Popper's examples, and even others I could think of, moral theories, religion, etc., often I find the persuasive argument at the end of the... actually, there's 2 things. The first is piggybacking on your comments about determinism. I'm actually unconvinced that determinism is an unfalsifiable theory. And the reason I say that is because in my mind, determinism simply follows from our current understandings of the laws of physics, meaning that we have our equations are dynamical in the sense that they take things as they are and say what they are going to be at time t+1. Whereas there's a world in which laws are allow for indeterminacy, where you say, like, that's not a logical impossibility to have physical laws that have built-in indeterminacy, right?
Well, actually, so if we just assume quantum mechanics is true, I'm going to leave aside all the many worlds stuff for now. Then that would be a refutation of...
No, because no. It's just because the wave equation is still a governing equation. It gives it gives possibilities, but it doesn't say anything can happen. It says this is a probabilistic, like it's telling you how the particle is evolving over time. It's telling you probabilistically, but it's telling you how it's evolving, right?
Well, so the wave equation, it would deterministically evolve, but that is the theory. But the actual particle itself, if you're at time t and you have to rewind, there's no way to say what it would have been at the time before, right? Because the actual physical thing in the real world, like stochasticity is the opposite of determinacy. So if you sample something, you can't know where it came from before the sample, right? Like there's no way to take a sample and then rewind the tape and know where it was the time before, because it could have been anywhere. So if we're going to talk about determinism as the thing which is opposed to free will, then
no, forget free will. Let's not go there. Let's not go there. Yeah.
So I mean, it's pretty well established that randomness is the opposite of determinism.
Okay, sure. I mean, determinism, I guess you can define it in a few ways, but that's fine. I'm happy to define it as you have. But then if we define it as you have and you take quantum mechanics as true, then it's falsified, right? So either way, it's a falsifiable theory.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great.
So I don't quite understand his points there. I mean, I agree with all of what you said about how he conflates it with prediction, et cetera, and that's got its own problems. But even just on its own, I was like, is this actually...
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
My second point is that I think often the arguments for against various metaphysical / philosophical theories do often bottom out in observations of the real world. So for instance, moral theories, which sort of on their own are irrefutable, people typically cash them out. Fucking ethicists are going to hate this, but people typically cash them out in terms of just like consequences. People typically say like, this is a shitty theory because it leads to female genital mutilation, right? Yeah. Or something. And then religion as well, while in theory is unfalsifiable. People often base their critiques on religion about saying like, look, you have some holy book that presumes to be written by an omniscient creator, but there's basics of astronomy that are contradicted by our modern day understanding, right? And so this isn't to say, this is sort of an adjacent point to the points Popper was making, right? But I think there's an interesting observation to be had that like once we actually start dealing seriously with metaphysical theories, we often sort of back up and lay our foundational critiques in something that is actually observational or scientific or something we can like really grapple with. And then we sort of build up from there.
Oh, so I was actually going to go a different direction with your comment.
Sure, go that direction.
But I love what you said. You're absolutely right that things tend to ground out to the scientific, and everyone's trying to claim that territory because they all recognize that's the valid territory. Even though, so where I was going to go with this is that falsification and falsifiability and stuff is partially a property of the theory, yes, but it's also a good chunk of it is a property of the person and the psychology, right? So
and culture,
right? So like I could say, and I do think that religion and astrology are completely falsifiable because my falsifiable test would be, okay, I'm going to wait 35 seconds for a miracle to happen, and I'm going to run that experiment 100 times. And if it doesn't happen in that time window, then I'm going to say God is refuted. But of course, no one would ever do that, right? Because it's about the mindset of someone who actually wants to undergo making their theories falsifiable. And similarly with astrology, yeah, you could run very simple experiments. But when we say these theories aren't falsifiable, it's because every time an experiment doesn't pan out, the theory just mutates and changes and figures out a way to explain that. And similarly, like in the Austrian blog post, Millet gave a number of falsifiable predictions in some of his papers, which I pointed out. And that actually just made me respect him more. He also, hilariously, believes in a technological singularity, just like Nick Bostrom and the long-termists. So enjoy that cognitive dissonance, folks. But he at least is attempting to do it. And so I was very impressed when I read those papers because he's taking his theory seriously enough to actually make predictions based upon it. And that just shows that it's not really only the theory in question. It's the theory plus the mindset of the person who is defending the theory.
And which underscores the importance of just argument in general, right? Because if falsifiability has this sort of sociological component, right, and people aren't quite going to agree on exactly what a crucial test is or like what would falsify a theory, then the importance of just argument in general becomes even more important, right? Like, okay, like that's fair that we're not the position of you don't agree that your prediction that the position of Mars influences whether I'm angry today or something, and then I'm not angry today, so for me that falsifies it. For you, you'll come up with something else. But we can still argue about astrology in general and like, okay, by what mechanism exactly are the planets influencing people's psychology and all these sorts of things, right? And so because that line, if and this is an interesting point actually, like for the logical positivists who needed every meaningful theory to be falsifiable, the fact that falsifiability has, and not entirely, but is somewhat constrained by psychological and cultural norms, kind of poses a problem for them, right? Because there's no completely bright line between what is and isn't. And probably you could just go down a rabbit hole of definitions, which I've actually never thought about this point before. Like trying to precisely define what a falsifiable theory is probably like an impossible task. Especially because new theories will probably have new modes of falsification that you couldn't have foreseen beforehand. So in some sense, it's similar to the idea that you can never fully define what an explanation is because there's always new modes of explanations emerging. That's great. And so, that's just like another problem for the logical positivists, right? Like you could never, Anyway, interesting.
Yeah. So I just have a concluding thought on this chapter, but that'll probably take us to the end of the episode. So are there any other concluding thoughts on your side that you want to get out there before we stick the landing and exit?
No, I don't think so. We pissed enough people off. So I'll shut up for the rest of this episode. Try and maintain what threads I have.
So I just had this interesting moment of rereading this chapter and being a bit underwhelmed, but finding that to be a good thing in the sense that I read this chapter for the first time. I was at a Barney's Cafe 6 years ago before History Beers. So I got there early and I read the chapter and I remember exactly where I was. Nice. And it just bowled me over because that was the moment when I realized that criticism and argument are kind of the unifying thing in science. It's not logical proof. It's not even falsification. It's criticism and argument and discussion. And rereading this now, I was like, yeah, okay, I get it. And that's to me a good thing, because it just shows that you've so digested the ideas that they're no longer like exciting.
Right.
But that's kind of the eventual goal for every learning discipline. So the more you spend time in Deutschian and Popperian circles, eventually you want to get to the state where you're just completely underwhelmed by all of it. That should be your goal, because that means you've fully learned it all. And then you move to something else. But the goal should be just, yeah, okay, I've heard this before, and move on. And that's a good thing. And that's the target. That means it's so digested in you that that you've learned the whole thing. And so I'm sure at some point, both us and our listeners are going to be kind of over the Popper subject. And
our listeners before us, they're already over it.
I mean, I will be obsessed about this forever, only because every time you reread it, you can go down different rabbit holes about like Copernicus and all that kind of thing. But I just want to flag that that's a good thing, and that means that it's fully a part of you now. And as soon as that happens, field switch, start learning about something else, switch to a different field, and keep doing that. So it was just like a nice reminder of like, oh yeah, good, it's working. This is what learning feels like, is being underwhelmed when you've reread something after 5 or 6 years. So yeah. And cool.
Great, man.
I'm so glad to be back at the Conjectures and Refutations series. So let's keep the momentum going. And I think we're eventually going to start doing a big exploration of libertarianism and Austrianism with Mr. Bruce Nielsen. So that'll be a lot of fun. And just keep pissing off our listeners. You guys can take it, right? You guys enjoy getting just a little rib in the side every once in a while. Yeah, I think it's good for all of us. Yeah. So, all right, brother. Well, this was fun. And we'll talk to you later. Yeah. See you next time.